I want you to think about the very last photograph you took on your phone. Just, put yourself back in that exact moment.
Ah, that's a really good exercise.
Right. So you pulled the device out of your pocket, you opened the app, and you held up this little glass rectangle to the world.
Yeah.
But I want you to think about what you actually did before your thumb hit that white button.
You probably shifted around a bit.
Exactly. Did you, shift your weight to change the angle? Did you take a half step back to maybe crop out a trash can on the edge of the frame?
Or wait for the lighting to get slightly better.
Right. Did you wait 3 seconds for the sun to come out? Or did you force a smile that you absolutely were not feeling just a moment prior?
It is a really profound question to start with because it just immediately shatters a deeply held illusion we all kind of share.
Which illusion is that?
Well, we tend to think of the camera as this passive recording device, like a thermometer.
Oh, a thermometer.
Yeah, you put a thermometer in a glass of water, the mercury rises, and it just gives you an objective physical fact, right?
Right. It doesn't have an opinion on the water.
Exactly. But the moment you start shifting your weight to hide a trash can, you are no longer recording a fact. You are actively constructing a fiction.
You're making a choice.
Yes, you are performing an act of exclusion.
And that tension, that massive chaotic chasm between the mechanical recording of light and the incredibly subjective human being choosing exactly what to point that machine at, that is exactly what we are exploring today.
It is the core of everything we're talking about.
We are taking a deep dive into the insights from Susan Bright's incredibly influential book, Art Photography Now.
It's such a vital text.
It really is. Our mission today is to basically trace how photography evolved. How did this medium go from being viewed as this cold, objective, humble servant of reality to becoming this hyper-aware, complex art form?
An art form that fundamentally questions what real even means, honestly.
Exactly. And Susan Bright's work is essential here because she doesn't just look at photographs as, putty objects on a wall.
No, she treats them as philosophical arguments.
Right.
She traces a history where artists slowly wake up to the immense power of that exclusion and inclusion you just described.
It's like the medium breaks its own rules to discover what it's actually capable of saying.
That's a perfect way to phrase it, yeah.
And we're going to look at 3 massive shifts today. First, how photographers completely dismantled the idea that a portrait captures your true inner soul.
That's a huge one.
Yeah. Second, how they stripped away the romantic, Instagram filter view of nature to force us to look at our actual footprint on the earth.
The landscape shift.
Right. And finally, how documentary photographers basically murdered the concept of objective truth and demanded that the viewer start doing the heavy lifting.
But, to understand how contemporary artists broke all these rules, we really have to understand the environment that birthed the rules in the first place.
We have to rewind.
Yes, all the way back to the very beginning. The arrival of photography in 1839.
I always try to imagine what that announcement must have felt like, honestly.
It must have been completely mind-blowing.
Like today, a new piece of disruptive technology drops, say, a new generative AI model. And half the world panics while the other half tries to monetize it.
Right, the usual cycle.
Yeah. So when the daguerreotype was announced in 1839, how did the traditional established art world actually react to this thing?
Well, it was a mixture of absolute marvel and, honestly, deep existential terror.
They were scared.
Very. You have to remember, for centuries, the sole province of capturing the visual world belonged to the painter. Or the draftsman, the sculptor.
It was a highly specialized skill.
Exactly. It required years of apprenticeship, a deep understanding of anatomy, of the chemistry of pigments, of perspective.
And then some guy with a box shows up.
Yeah. Suddenly, a chemist with a silver-plated sheet of copper and some noxious chemicals can capture the exact rendering of a cathedral in just a few minutes.
So the painters were terrified they were going to be out of a job, right?
I mean, some were, certainly,
Yeah.
especially miniature portrait painters. But the broader institutional art world, the academies, the critics, they went straight on the defensive. They tried to immediately put this new machine in a very specific, submissive box. They argued, rather optimistically, that photography was merely a factotum.
A factotum, like a lackey.
Yes, an assistant. A tool to gather reference material so the real artist could go back to the studio and paint a masterpiece.
They essentially said, this is a great little gadget, but it has no soul.
Exactly. The prevailing thought was that because a machine was doing the rendering, it lacked the capacity for true artistic expression.
Because there was no hand of the artist.
Right. They believed real art required the divine intervention of the human hand and spirit.
I was reading through the sources, and there's this incredible quote Susan Bright highlights from the French poet and art critic Charles Baudelaire.
Oh, the 1859 Salon Review. It's iconic.
Yes, this is from 1859. He is actively protesting the fact that photographs are being displayed alongside paintings at the Paris Salon.
Which was a massive deal back then.
Just to set the stage for you, what was the Paris Salon exactly?
So, the Paris Salon was the absolute pinnacle of the art world at the time. It was this annual or sometimes biennial exhibition sanctioned by the state.
Like the Oscars for painters.
Pretty much. If you were accepted into the salon, your career was made. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with these massive, sweeping historical paintings, mythological scenes, grand portraits.
It was the temple of high culture.
It really was.
And into this temple, someone brings these little chemical photographs. And Baudelaire just loses his mind.
He was furious.
He insists that photography must be confined to its real task, which he says is to be the humble servant of science and art.
Humble servant.
Yeah. And then he delivers the ultimate insult. He says it is a very humble servant, quote, like typography and stenography, which have neither created nor improved literature.
It is a brilliantly condescending critique, isn't it?
It's so harsh.
It is. But Baudelaire is expressing a very deep anxiety about the mechanization of modern life. By comparing photography to typography, the mere printing of letters on a page, or stenography, which is just the shorthand recording of what someone else is saying, he is entirely stripping the photographer of any creative agency.
It's like looking at a beautifully written novel and praising their typewriter.
Yes.
He's saying the camera is just a typewriter for light. It can record the data, but it can't write the poetry.
That is a perfect analogy, and this attitude set up the central paradox that haunted photography for over a century.
Which paradox?
Well, the very things that made it a miracle, its mechanical precision, its ability to be reproduced, its prolific use in commercial life, were the exact reasons it was denied the status of high art.
The eternal annoying question. But is it art?
Yes. Because, as Bright brilliantly articulates in the book, photography has always suffered from a promiscuous nature.
I stopped dead when I read that phrase in the text. Promiscuous nature.
It's evocative, isn't it?
It is such a loaded, fascinating way to describe a medium. What exactly does she mean by that?
Think about a painting. A painting is almost always understood as art. It lives in a gallery or an ornate frame in a living room.
Right, it's definitely art.
It has a singular intrinsic character. But photography sleeps around, so to speak.
Oh, I see.
It lends itself to an infinite number of completely unrelated uses.
Like, I take a photo of my dog to text my mom.
Exactly.
And a police officer takes a photo of a crime scene for evidence. A real estate agent takes a photo of a kitchen to sell a house. An astronomer takes a photo of a galaxy.
Right. You see photography in daily newspapers, in surveillance feeds, in glossy fashion magazines, and in medical textbooks.
It's everywhere.
And because its meaning can slip and slide entirely depending on the context in which it is presented, the traditional art establishment felt it had no inherent artistic value of its own.
It was too common.
Too common and way too useful.
So if photography is this promiscuous utilitarian thing, how did it ever break out of that box?
No, it took a long time.
I always kind of assumed photographers just kept trying to make their photos look more and more like paintings to prove they were artists.
Some certainly did, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
The pictorialists.
Yes. They used soft focus lenses and textured paper to make their photos look like charcoal drawings or impressionist paintings.
Trying to mimic the accepted art forms.
Exactly. But the true paradigm shift, the moment contemporary art photography really begins, happens when they stop doing that.
When they stop apologizing for being a machine.
Precisely. As we move into the 1960s and 70s, you see a generation of artists profoundly influenced by thinkers like Walter Benjamin.
Oh, Benjamin is huge in this space.
Massive. He wrote extensively about what happens to art in the age of mechanical reproduction. He argued that reproducing an image strips away its unique aura.
The aura. Like the magical feeling of standing in front of the actual Mona Lisa.
Yes.
Just knowing Da Vinci's hand touched that exact canvas. You definitely can't get that from a postcard in the gift shop.
Exactly. And instead of mourning the loss of that aura, these new artists in the 60s and 70s celebrated it.
They leaned into it.
They leaned entirely into photography's banality. They stopped trying to prove it was pure art.
How does that actually work in practice, though? If you aren't trying to make it look like a masterpiece, what are you doing with it?
Well, you start utilizing the most artless, sincere forms of photography imaginable.
Like what?
Artists began mimicking passport portraits, real estate advertisements, forensic evidence photos, and textbook illustrations.
Oh, wow.
They took the fact that photography was inextricably tied to science and journalism, the very thing Baudelaire hated, and used it as a weapon.
That is so clever.
It really was. They proved that the evidentiary nature of a photograph is actually a very delicate illusion.
So if Baudelaire said the camera is just a typewriter, these artists decided to start typing up fake ransom notes and fake scientific reports.
Basically, yeah.
Just to prove that the typewriter can lie just as well as a pen.
That is a wonderful way to put it. They showed that what we see in a photograph always depends entirely on what we expect to see.
Context is everything.
And once you establish that the camera is an unreliable narrator, that it can adopt disguises, you open up entirely new frontiers for exploring the human condition.
Which brings us to the most intimate frontier of all, the human face.
Yes.
Let's shift our focus to portraiture and this concept of deconstructing the soul. Because looking at a portrait feels like the most natural thing in the world, right?
It does.
But the assumptions underneath it are incredibly heavy.
They really are. The history of traditional portraiture operates on a very rigid, recognized triangle of relationships.
The sitter, the photographer, and the spectator.
Yes. And the fundamental, almost religious belief underpinning this triangle for centuries was that a portrait could capture a person's core essence.
We desperately want to believe that, don't we?
Oh, completely.
Like you look at that famous photograph of Abraham Lincoln taken right before he died.
The one by Alexander Gardner?
Yeah. You see the lines on his face, the exhaustion in his eyes. You look at that and you think, I am seeing the crushing weight of the Civil War. I am looking into his soul.
We treat the face as a transparent window to the inner self. We do, but it is largely a projection. As Bright notes, the inner workings of a complex human psyche can never truly be understood just by examining a two-dimensional arrangement of light and shadow on paper.
Because it's just a fraction of a second.
It is a fraction of a second, and it is highly negotiated.
What do you mean by negotiated?
Well, the subject adopts a specific version of themselves, a self fashioned specifically for the camera in that precise moment.
They pose.
Right. Then the photographer chooses the angle, the lighting, and the exact moment to click the shutter to emphasize their own interpretation of the subject.
Oh, it's already filtered twice.
Exactly. And then years later, you, the spectator, arrive with your entire history, your knowledge of the Civil War, and your emotional state, and you project all of that onto Lincoln's face.
So it's not a window at all, it's a mirror.
It is very much a mirror.
If I take a picture of a friend smiling, and I post it with the caption, just got a huge promotion, you look at the smile and see triumph and joy.
Naturally.
But if I take the exact same photograph, the identical pixels, and change the caption to smiling through the pain of a terrible breakup, you suddenly see sorrow and resilience in the corners of their mouth.
Yes.
The image hasn't changed at all, but the identity has been completely rewritten by context.
A perfect demonstration. Identity is fluid, not fixed. And no artist in the history of the medium has investigated, exposed, and weaponized this fluidity more powerfully than Cindy Sherman.
Oh, let's talk about Cindy Sherman, because her work is an absolute earthquake in the art world.
Truly monumental.
I hear her name constantly, but I want to really dig into what she's actually doing, because she is basically taking a sledgehammer. No, not a sledgehammer. That's too clumsy.
A scalpel.
Yeah. Or she's conducting a visual Turing test on the concept of the true self.
I like visual Turing test. That fits perfectly. Sherman operates entirely within the postmodern belief that there is no singular, authentic, hidden soul waiting to be captured.
Okay, you just used the word postmodern.
Ah, right.
I hear that thrown around in art history classes and cultural commentary all the time. But if I'm being completely honest, I'm never entirely sure what it actually means in the practical sense.
It can be a very dense term.
Especially when we're talking about someone just holding a camera. Yeah, can we break that down? What is a postmodern belief regarding identity?
It is a fantastic question because the jargon often obscures a very relatable concept.
Please demystify it for me.
So, modernism, the era that came before, believed in grand narratives, objective truths, and essential cores. It believed that underneath all the layers of society, there was an authentic you.
Like a true self.
Right. Postmodernism rejects that entirely. It suggests that what you consider to be you is actually just a collage of cultural scripts, language, and media influences.
Wait, so there is no core underneath the layers of the whole thing.
Exactly. In a postmodern view, our identities are made up of multiple interchangeable selves.
You just put them on.
We ditch them up and adopt them through a continuous series of performances and masquerades. We learn how to be a professional, or a mother, or a rebel by absorbing the tropes that culture peddles to us.
Mostly through mass media and imagery.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes Sherman's landmark series make complete sense. Let's look at the untitled film stills.
Her most famous body of work.
She produced these between 1977 and 1982. It's a series of 69 small black and white images.
Right.
And I was looking at these in the source materials, and I noticed something very specific. They don't look like fancy gallery prints.
No, they don't.
They don't have that rich, velvety Ansel Adams fine art quality at all. They look like something you'd find in a dusty manila folder in a 1950s Hollywood casting office.
But they do, yeah.
Why did she print them like that?
The material detail of the object is crucial to understanding her intent. Sherman deliberately moved away from the mannered, highly crafted fine art prints of the previous photographic eras.
She wanted them to look cheap.
Yes. She used cheap, glossy, 8x10 resin-coated prints.
The exact kind of mass-produced stuff press agents used.
Exactly. She wanted them to feel disposable, mass-mediated, and authentic to the visual language of post-war cinema.
That makes total sense.
In these 69 images, Sherman adopts the roles of stereotypical, cliched women, and we instantly recognize every single one of these tropes because we've seen the movies.
Right. You look at one, and you immediately say, oh, that's the naive ingenue arriving in the big city with her suitcase.
Yes.
You look at another and say, that's the jilted, vengeful lover staring out a rain-streaked window.
Yeah.
Or you see the bored, distressed housewife in the kitchen.
And the brilliant defining aspect of this work is that she is the only person in every single one of these photographs.
It's all her.
It is all her. She plays all of these roles, but she plays them with absolute deadpan sincerity.
There's no winking at the camera.
None at all. She creates these utterly believable cinematic fantasy worlds, and crucially, she never names the characters or the movies. They are simply titled Untitled.
Which basically forces me, the viewer, to finish the script.
Exactly.
She gives me a visual prompt, a woman looking off camera with a look of dread, and my brain automatically fills in the approaching villain.
Your brain does the work for her.
She proves that these stereotypes are so deeply hardwired into our brains that we hallucinate the rest of the movie just from one cheap, glossy photo.
She exposes the mechanics of fictional femininity perfectly. And, she continued this deep investigation of the masquerade throughout her career.
But her style changed, right?
She constantly evolved the aesthetic, yes, but maintained the core philosophical inquiry. If we jump forward to her later work, specifically the studio portraits from the year 2000.
Oh, Untitled, #395, #396, and #397.
Yes. She completely shifts her target.
These are fascinating and, frankly, deeply uncomfortable to look at.
They are very challenging images.
These aren't cinematic movie stills anymore. These are imitating the conventions of the professional suburban studio portrait.
Yes. The kind of portrait you would commission to display on a grand piano.
Right. Meant to broadcast a family's status, wealth, and respectability, showing everyone in their absolute Sunday best.
Exactly. But she doesn't just mimic them, she pastiches them.
She pushes it too far.
She takes these stereotypical female types, maybe the aging socialite or the overly eager suburban PTA president, and pushes them just slightly into the realm of the ridiculous.
The key to these 2000s portraits, for me anyway, is the makeup.
Oh, the makeup is crucial.
She uses heavily caked on, poorly applied makeup. It no longer functions to enhance beauty. It functions as an incredibly obvious mask.
Right, the foundation is too thick, the lipstick bleeds, the eyeliner is harsh.
It's a masquerade where the disguise is intentionally failing. You can literally see the seams.
Yeah.
It makes you feel physical pity and revulsion at the same time because you can see the desperate performance of trying to appear put together, just falling apart under the harsh studio light.
Exactly. She is highlighting the sheer exhaustion of maintaining these cultural performances of identity.
I have to ask about her process, though, because creating work this psychologically heavy, where you are the model, the director, the wardrobe designer, and the photographer.
It's a lot of hats to wear.
It's an entirely solitary pursuit, isn't it?
It is, and that solitary nature is one of the most defining characteristics of her practice. Sherman works intuitively, alone in her studio.
Just her?
Just her. She relies heavily on using a mirror to, as she says, summon something.
What does that mean, to summon something? Is she literally just trying on wigs until she feels a personality arrive?
Quite literally, yes. She has stated repeatedly that she does not start with a rigid concept.
So no sketches beforehand?
No, she doesn't write a script or draw a storyboard. She works intuitively with the props, the prosthetics, the makeup, and the mirror. She doesn't even know what character she is looking for until she sees a stranger staring back at her in the reflection. Once the stranger arrives, she captures it.
That is wild to me. It's an act of psychological channeling?
Very much so.
But surely, as she got massively famous and the productions got more elaborate, she had to bring in help, right? She couldn't do the lighting and the makeup all by herself forever. Did she ever try using assistants?
She did attempt it once, driven partly by guilt, actually.
Guilt. Why?
Well, in the beginning of her career, when she began experiencing meteoric success, she felt guilty that her friends in the art world weren't getting the same recognition.
Oh, that's kind of sweet.
Yeah, so she thought she could share the wealth, so to speak, by paying assistants or having other people model.
Did it work?
It was a complete failure for her.
Why? I mean, she's dressing up in costumes. Isn't that easy enough to direct?
Because of the tone. The people she brought into the studio treated the process like a game.
Oh, I see.
They thought it was fun. They treated it like dressing up for Halloween.
They were winking at the camera. They were being ironic.
Exactly. And Sherman realized that the psychic levels she was trying to reach were absolutely not about having fun.
Right?
There are deep, psychological, often unsettling, and highly vulnerable layers she is aiming for in her performances.
You can't just joke your way into that.
No, you can't. Furthermore, because her process is so deeply intuitive and nonverbal, she found it impossible to articulate to a model what she wanted them to emote, because she herself didn't know what it was until the precise moment it materialized.
She couldn't direct them to find a ghost they couldn't see.
Exactly.
She said she just wanted to rush through the shoot and get them out of her studio so she could be alone again.
Yeah, it just didn't work for her process.
It's such a deeply internal, solitary process. Which is funny, considering how massively analyzed her work is. I mean, academics write 1,000-page treatises on her work.
They really do.
Did her own family understand what she was doing?
Not initially, no. She has recalled in interviews how her family would make jokes at her expense. They would say things like, oh, she's still just dressing up like she did when she was a kid, or they would imply that it didn't take any brains or real artistic skill to do what she was doing.
That is brutal. But also, is there a grain of truth to it?
How so?
I don't mean that it doesn't take brains. Obviously, it's genius. But the idea that it originates from a very primal, childlike place of play and dress up.
It is actually a very profound observation, despite their intent to mock her.
Right.
Sherman herself freely admits that she does not theorize when she works. She isn't reading French philosophy and then deciding to make a photograph to illustrate a thesis.
It's just doing it.
Yeah. She has mentioned reading dense, academic, theoretical essays written about her own art and thinking to herself, where on earth did they get that?
The academics are projecting onto her the exact same way we project onto the portraits.
Exactly. The work is entirely intuitive, but that raw, pre-verbal intuition perfectly captures the incredibly fluid, interchangeable nature of modern identity that academic theory requires thousands of words of complicated jargon to explain.
She bypassed the intellect and went straight to the visual truth.
Perfectly said.
But, this brings up a massive conceptual hurdle for me. And it's a pushback I have to level against how we categorize her work.
Okay, let's hear it.
We often call these self-portraits. But if Cindy Sherman is the only person in the photographs, yet she is literally always pretending to be someone else, are these actually self-portraits?
That is the big question.
Or is she simply using her physical body as a piece of raw material, the exact same way a painter uses a blank canvas, or a sculptor uses a lump of clay.
You have hit on the exact complication her work deliberately introduces to the entire genre.
Okay, so I'm not crazy for wondering that.
Not at all. Are we looking at a portrait of Cindy Sherman, or are we looking at a photograph of an entirely distinct fictional person who just happens to share her atomic structure?
Right.
It is never clearly resolved. She meticulously picks away at the concept of the self within the self-portrait.
She removes herself entirely.
Yes, she removes all the biographical clues, the personal context, the authentic vulnerability that usually helps us understand a person, and she leaves us with a highly formal presentation of a cultural character.
It's the ultimate masquerade. There is no Cindy Sherman in the photos. There is only the mask.
Exactly.
And honestly, looking at this work from the 70s and 80s, it feels so prophetic. It makes me think immediately of how we operate today with modern social media avatars.
How so? Connect those dots for me.
Well, we all curate these multiple distinct selves depending on the platform we are logging into, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You have your LinkedIn self, which is hyper-professional, driven, and uses corporate buzzwords.
Right, the professional mask.
Then you have your Instagram self, which is aesthetic, adventurous, and perfectly lit. And then you have your anonymous forum self, where you might be aggressive or highly vulnerable.
Very true.
We are all adopting and discarding personalities for the digital camera multiple times a day. We are all running our own little untitled film stills productions from our bedrooms.
We really are.
Cindy Sherman was just doing it decades before we had the technology hardwired into our pockets.
A very astute and slightly terrifying connection. She exposed how identity is not a monolith carved in stone, but a continuous series of negotiations with the visual culture that surrounds us.
Okay, so we've looked deeply at the internal landscape, the identity, the soul, the construction of the self.
Yes.
Now, I want to pivot completely and look at the actual physical external landscape. We are moving into the realm of our footprint on the earth.
A major shift in the book.
Because if we dress up our own faces for the camera, we absolutely tried to dress up nature too.
We certainly did. The camera and the physical land have a long, deeply intertwined and often problematic history.
Well, so.
As Susan Bright notes, photography emerged in the mid-19th century during a time of massive, expanding global exploration, industrialization, and travel.
It was the perfect tool for an empire, really. Early landscape photography was heavily tied to colonization, to geological surveys, to mapping the unknown. You send a guy with a camera out west, he brings back a picture of a mountain, and suddenly you own it.
Yes. It was central to the Victorian desire to categorize, control, and order the natural world.
Right.
And initially, these photographic images of the land were heavily categorized through the aesthetic lens of the picturesque.
Okay, there's another art history term, the picturesque.
Yes.
If I look at a landscape and say it looks picturesque, I usually just mean it looks pretty, like a postcard.
Yeah.
What does it mean formally?
Formally, the picturesque was an aesthetic principle borrowed directly from landscape painting, particularly from the 18th century.
Okay.
It aimed to tame the wild, chaotic, and often terrifying reality of nature into an easily understood, romantic, and safely consumable frame.
This is about composing the shot, putting a nice framing tree branch in the foreground, a winding river in the middle ground, and a majestic mountain in the background.
Exactly. It was about creating a rural idyll. A comforting visual structure.
They didn't want it to look wild and scary.
No, they wanted to take this vast, indifferent wilderness and make it look like a charming painting you could comfortably hang in a bourgeois parlor.
And this romanticization reaches its absolute peak with the modernists in the early and mid-20th century.
Yes, it did.
People like Ansel Adams and Edward Weston, they are the giants of the landscape.
Yeah.
And they made it pure.
They did. They completely rejected the soft-focus, painterly approach of the 19th century and instead dazzled the world with sheer technical photographic brilliance.
The hyper-sharp images.
Right. They used small apertures for infinite depth of field, dramatic plays of light and shadow, and intense contrast to express what they felt was an almost metaphysical, spiritual presence inherent in the landscape.
You look at an Ansel Adams photograph of Yosemite Valley Moon and Half Dome, for instance, and you feel small. You feel awe.
It's sublime.
The rocks look like they were carved by gods. The light is glorious. But reading through Bright's analysis, it becomes painfully obvious that his work is also kind of a lie, isn't it? Or at least a massive omission.
It is an omission, yes. They idealized the land. They self-assuredly declared that their breathtaking vistas of pristine, untouched nature were the highest form of art.
Right?
But they achieved that pristine look by pointing the camera strictly upward and outward. deliberately cropping out any signs of human habitation, industry, or destruction that might have been just outside the frame.
Which brings us to the breaking point, because by the 1960s and 70s, you couldn't really point the camera anywhere without seeing humans in act.
No, you couldn't.
The landscape didn't look like an Ansel Adams calendar anymore. It looked like a strip mall.
That is the crux of the massive shift that occurred. As our relationship with the land became increasingly complex and industrialized, there was a horrific realization among a new generation of artists.
What was the realization?
In the age-old romantic battle between nature and culture, it appeared unequivocally that culture was winning, and the environmental cost was immense.
Enter the new topographics. This was a seminal movement, a specific exhibition in 1975 that completely flipped the script on landscape photography. We are talking about photographers like Robert Adams, Louis Baltz, and Stephen Shore. What did they actually do differently from Ansel Adams?
Well, they actively flattened out the landscape.
Flattened it out.
They deliberately stripped away the soaring romanticism, the dramatic lighting, and the metaphysical awe of the modernists. They approached the land with a deadpan, seemingly objective, almost scientific gaze.
The thermometer again.
Exactly. But more importantly, their subject matter changed radically. They were no longer seeking out the untouched wilderness.
They went looking for the ugly stuff.
They actively sought out and documented the spread of tract housing, suburbia, anonymous industrial parks, pollution, parking lots, and the undeniable disappearance of pristine land.
It's like taking the warm, glowing, highly saturated Instagram filter off a beautiful travel photo and then panning the camera slightly to the left to show the ugly, cracked concrete parking lot, the overflowing trash cans, and the neon sign of a fast food drive-thru.
That is exactly what they did.
They forced the viewer to look at what was actually there, not what we wished was there.
They made it intellectually impossible to look at the land in a subjective, romantic way without critically engaging with human consumption and the grim reality of so-called economic progress.
Yeah.
They showed human intervention not just as a blight on the subject, but as the fundamental raw material of the modern landscape itself.
Let's look at how contemporary artists have taken this baton and sprinted with it, because the examples in Bright's book are mind-blowing. Let's start with Andreas Gursky.
A monumental figure.
He is probably one of the most famous contemporary photographers alive.
Gursky is vital when discussing the contemporary landscape, particularly regarding the concept of scale and globalism. He creates these mammoth, giant format prints. We are talking about photographs that are 10 to 15 feet across.
The physical presence of a photo that big must be staggering.
It is. They are so massive and incredibly detailed that the viewer is invited to almost fall into the scene to experience it physically. Your eye physically travels across the surface of the image for minutes at a time.
And he uses these incredibly high, distant, almost impossible viewpoints, right? It's like a God's eye view.
Very much so.
But he's not looking down at a Grand Canyon. He's looking down at the floor of Stock Exchange, or the interior of an Amazon distribution center, or a discount supermarket.
He uses that hyper-distant vantage point to analyze consumerism, mass production, and their overwhelming effects on the land and society.
It's so detached.
By stepping so far back, both physically and emotionally, he offers us a macro view of global capitalism that we could never experience from the ground level.
I'm thinking of his famous photograph, 99-cent Second Diptychon.
A perfect example.
It's just aisles and aisles of brightly colored, cheap candy and goods in a discount store. And because of the scale and the fact that everything is in sharp focus, the cheap consumer goods turn into this dizzying, abstract sea of color.
It almost stops looking real.
It turns the overwhelming scale of global consumption into a hypnotic visual spectacle.
It is sublime, but it is a terrifying manufactured sublimity.
Yeah.
And then we have artists who take a similar distant approach but apply it to environments we traditionally associate with nature and escape. Consider Walter Niedermayer.
Yes, Niedermayer photographs alpine retreats, snowy mountain peaks, ski resorts, the exact places people go to get away from the industrial world.
Places of fantasy, holidays, and perceived purity.
Right.
But Niedermayer surveys these blindingly white, snowy scenes from a massive distance. He often uses multiple images stitched together to emphasize the sheer expanse.
And the result is kind of hilarious, but also deeply cynical. When you look at his photos, you see these massive, indifferent white glaciers, and then swarming all over them are these tiny, brightly colored dots.
So you realize those dots are...
Thousands of tourists in neon ski jackets.
Yes. It completely undercuts the majesty of the mountain. By reducing humans to the scale of swarming ants, he highlights the absolute absurdity of our presence there.
We look so out of place.
He makes the massive tourist industry and our desperate human desire to conquer and consume the natural landscape for leisure look slightly ridiculous.
It's like we are an infestation on the ice.
Right.
He actually had a quote where he stated that no landscape interests him purely as a landscape. He's only interested in the landscape in which man is present.
A very telling quote.
But there must be a certain intensity to that human presence to show the transformation.
He is documenting the friction between the eternal geology of the mountain and the fleeting, consumer-driven desires of the tourists on top of it.
And then, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum of scale, we have Simone Newegg. She doesn't use the God's eye view.
No, she is very grounded.
She takes a highly localized, almost forensic approach. She doesn't look at grand mountains or global stock exchanges. She looks at small vegetable gardens and local allotments.
Newegg's work is brilliant because it captures a very specific, quiet, ongoing tension. She photographs the ancient, humble discipline of planting in regimented rows. Her subject matter is the interplay between purposeful, geometric human planning on one hand and unpredictable, instinctive, chaotic natural growth on the other.
She gets right down to the dirt. She contrasts the neat, straight rows of cabbages with these modern, makeshift, often ugly gardening tools.
The plastic tools.
Yeah, you see repurposed plastic soda bottles, blue plastic tarps, and old buckets being used to protect the plants.
It is a micro-landscape of control versus wildness. It is the human desire to tame nature enacted on the scale of a backyard.
She said she actually finds it reassuring that nature protects its dynamic power despite all our clumsy human interventions with plastic and fences. The weeds always grow back.
It is a profound philosophical observation regarding resilience and survival, found in the most banal, easily overlooked of settings, a cabbage patch on the edge of a town.
But, looking at Newegg and Niedermeyer, and especially Gursky, brings up a really provocative question for me regarding this entire genre of contemporary landscape photography. And I want to challenge this approach.
Please do, I welcome it.
If you take a photographer like Gursky, or any artist who photographs a massively polluted industrial site, or an overwhelming, soulless consumer space like a factory floor, and they print it in this beautiful, vibrant, large-scale, incredibly detailed format that costs tens of thousands of dollars.
Right.
Does making it visually stunning accidentally glorify the very destruction it is trying to critique?
That is the most persistent and dangerous tightrope these artists walk. It is a highly debated topic in art criticism.
Because it's so pretty.
When you use the aesthetic tools of high, art-perfect, formal composition, massive scale, stunning clarity, beautiful color palettes to depict a toxic e-waste dump in Africa or a soul-crushing distribution center, you run the very real risk of aestheticizing the tragedy.
Right. You're staring at an aerial shot of a toxic oil slick on a river, and instead of thinking about the dead fish and the poisoned water supply, you find yourself thinking, wow, look at the gorgeous iridescence of the purples and greens in that oil. It looks like a painting.
Exactly.
The beauty completely distracts from the horror.
It can numb the viewer to the reality of the subject. However, the counter-argument, the defense mounted by many of these artists, is the concept of the Trojan horse.
The Trojan horse. Using beauty as a trap.
Exactly. In our modern, image-saturated world, we are bombarded with horrific, gritty, ugly images of disaster on the news constantly.
We see it every day.
And our natural defense mechanism is to scroll past them. We turn away from the ugly. But by using seductive beauty, sublime scale, and perfect composition, the artist draws the viewer in.
You hook them visually.
You hook them, you hold their attention in the gallery space long enough for them to marvel at the colors. And then as they look closer, the critical realization sets in.
I see.
They realize they are marveling at poison or at exploitation. The beauty is the bait, and the critique is the hook. If the image were simply repulsive, the viewer would turn away immediately and the intellectual engagement would never happen.
That actually makes a lot of sense. You have to lower their defenses with aesthetics before you can challenge their worldview.
It's a calculated strategy.
And speaking of challenging the viewer, we are moving into our final major conceptual shift today, the death of objective truth. We are diving into the concept of ambiguity in the new documentary photography.
This is perhaps the most intellectually demanding shift we will discuss, because the concept of the document in photography is historically weighty.
It carried a lot of baggage.
For over a century, documentary photography laid claim to absolute, certifiable truth. It was seen as an unimpeachable, objective witness to history.
If you want to understand indexicality, this is where it lives.
Indexicality. We should probably clarify that term.
Please do.
Yeah.
I've heard it described as the physical connection between the object and the photograph.
Yeah.
Like a footprint in the mud. The mud doesn't have an opinion about the boot. It doesn't judge the boot. It just physically, chemically records the fact that the boot was there.
That is a flawless analogy. Photography was believed to be an index of reality. Light physically bounces off the subject and chemically burns into the film. Therefore, it cannot lie.
It's physical evidence.
And traditional documentary photographers utilize this unquestioned belief with a fierce humanistic or social reformist agenda.
We're talking about the pioneers of the genre. People like Jacob Riis, dragging his heavy flash powder cameras into the squalid, dangerous slums of New York in the 1890s to photograph the horrific living conditions of immigrants.
Right.
Or Louis Hine, sneaking into factories a few years later to photograph children working on dangerous textile looms.
Yes. They used the camera as an instrument of social justice. The photograph was undeniable, indexical evidence of horrific conditions.
And it changed things, didn't it?
It was designed to shock the comfortable classes and spur society into legislative action. And it worked. Child labor laws were changed because of those photographs.
That's amazing.
The power of the image resided entirely in the belief that the camera perfectly recorded the real world without prejudice.
It was the ultimate infallible witness. But contemporary documentary has completely abandoned that certainty, hasn't it? Yeah. Faith in the footprint in the mud is gone.
It is entirely gone. Contemporary artists operate on the fundamental, hard-won belief that photography is not a neutral medium.
No.
It does not somehow miraculously bypass human subjectivity, political prejudice, and cultural ideology. They understand deeply that a photograph does not simply present the world as it is.
Because, as we talked about at the very beginning with the smartphone, the photographer is always choosing what to include and what to crop out.
Exactly. So, if a photograph is inherently subjective, how can you ethically call it a document of truth?
So what do? If it's not the objective truth anymore, do they just give up on documenting the world entirely?
Not at all. But they change their approach entirely. Contemporary documentary finds a very slippery, highly complex position somewhere between the traditional factual photographic document and the subjective conceptual art photograph.
They blur the lines.
They actively try to escape the trap of emotive photojournalism, the kind of photography that manipulates lighting and framing to dictate exactly how you should feel about a victim or a situation. Instead of certainty, they embrace ambiguity.
They don't want to be the voice of God narrator telling you the moral of the story.
Right.
Let's look at how they actually execute this ambiguity, because the strategies are fascinating. Let's talk about Susan Meiselas and her incredibly important work, Encounters with the Dani.
Meiselas is a giant in documentary photography. For this project, she traveled to the Baliem Valley in Papua, Indonesia to document the Dani people. This is an indigenous group that has experienced massive traumatic cultural shifts due to colonization, missionary work, and modern tourism.
So the traditional photojournalist approach would be to go there, take highly emotive, beautifully lit portraits of the Dani people, maybe show them in traditional dress, juxtaposed with modern technology, and publish a magazine spread showing the tragedy of lost culture.
Precisely. That is the traditional authorial voice.
Yeah.
But Meiselas realized something critical about the power dynamics of photography. She realized that the complex, layered history of this culture and its ongoing trauma simply could not be conveyed through her own contemporary images alone.
It wasn't enough.
A single image, or even a single photographer's essay, is too limited and too biased.
So what did she do? She didn't just publish her own photos, did she?
She adopted a curatorial strategy. She gathered archival materials. She found photographs taken by early Dutch colonists, by earnest missionaries, by previous anthropologists measuring skulls, and by casual modern tourists passing through.
Wow, she pulled from everyone.
Yes.
And she laid them all out together. By putting a blurry colored tourist snapshot of a Dani ritual next to a clinical black and white anthropologist study from 60 years ago, and then placing her own contemporary artistic work right beside them. She creates this incredible friction.
Exactly.
She forces you to see how different everyone's version of the truth is.
She uses the archive to emphasize subjectivity. She actively refuses to privilege her own perspective over the others.
That's powerful.
She positions herself not as the ultimate authority, but as just one of many compromised storytellers. It brilliantly undermines the traditional heroic authority of the solo documentary photographer.
It's an admission of limitation. And then we have another strategy, utilized by Alan Sekula.
Ah, Sekula.
He documented the devastating Prestige oil spill off the coast of Galicia, Spain, in his series Black Tide. But he didn't just rely on the dramatic visuals of the disaster, did he?
No, Sekula was highly suspicious of the spectacular, highly aestheticized disaster photograph. He believed that just showing a picture of a bird covered in black oil elicited cheap sympathy, but offered zero political understanding of why the oil was there in the first place.
He didn't want the Trojan horse. He thought the beauty was too distracting.
Exactly. So he combined image and text in a way that radically shifts the reading away from the single frame. He wrote extensive, politically charged, highly detailed essays to accompany the photographs.
So the text is mandatory.
In his work, language is at the absolute heart of the photograph's significance.
So if you just look at this photo of a dark wave hitting a rock, it might look like a moody seascape.
Yes, very atmospheric.
But when you read the accompanying text detailing the deregulated shipping industry, the failures of the state response, and the ecological collapse of the local fishing economy, the image transforms into political evidence. Without the text, the viewer is largely lost regarding the specific context.
The photograph cannot stand alone. It requires the anchor of language. But perhaps the most visually striking and technically radical example of this ambiguity is Paul Graham's series, American Night.
Oh man, I was absolutely mesmerized by these images. Graham is attempting to document something incredibly abstract and pervasive.
The social fracture of America.
Yeah, the racial divide and the hidden poverty in the suburban and urban landscapes. But how he does it is mind-bending.
Graham adopted a highly unusual, almost aggressive technical approach. He deliberately overexposed images of suburban houses, empty sidewalks, and marginalized figures to an extreme degree.
Way too much light.
He let so much light hit the film that the images are blown out into blinding, misty pastel whites.
I want you to imagine stepping out of a pitch-black movie theater into the glaring midday sunlight, surrounded by fresh snow.
That physical sensation.
Yeah, that physical feeling of your pupils contracting. You literally have to squint your eyes, almost painfully, to figure out what you are looking at in his photographs.
It takes effort to view them.
The shadows are completely lifted. The houses and the people look like they're dissolving into the blinding atmosphere.
And this visual technique, this deliberate destruction of the image's clarity through overexposure, is a profound metaphor. It brilliantly mimics the visual blindness of society to itself.
It's about how we intentionally choose not to see the social fracture and poverty right in front of us. The marginalized person walking on the edge of the suburban highway is bathed in light, but they are invisible.
Precisely. He forces the viewer to physically struggle to see the subject, mirroring the psychological struggle required to acknowledge inequality.
He has this incredible revealing quote about the public reception of this work.
I know the one you mean.
He noted that people readily accept digitally darkened, moody, high-contrast street corners as faithful or authentic representations of urban grit and reality.
Yes, we are conditioned to believe that.
But when he presented these high-key, overexposed, blindingly bright images, people viewed them with intense suspicion. They complained that they were manipulated, they felt tricked.
It perfectly reveals our inherent learned biases about what reality should look like in a photograph.
Right.
We have been trained by cinema and news to accept dark, moody shadows as authentic documentary truth. But we reject blinding light as an artificial artistic trick, even though both darkness and lightness are just basic technical manipulations of the camera's exposure triangle.
Both are constructed. Neither is the objective truth.
Exactly.
But, this brings me to a major fundamental pushback against this entire new documentary style, and I really want you to defend this.
All right, I'm ready.
If a documentary photograph is so intentionally ambiguous that I literally need to read a 5-page political essay to understand what is happening, like with Sekula's work, or if it's so intentionally overexposed that I physically have to squint and guess what the subject is, like Graham's work,
Oh.
hasn't it failed its primary mission as a photograph?
Fail how?
Well, it feels like a journalist publishing a completely blank page in the newspaper and asking the reader to just imagine the news using their own biases.
Yeah.
How do you defend making a document that doesn't actually document anything clearly?
It is a very valid structural challenge. If you believe the goal of documentary photography is purely the immediate efficient transfer of factual information like a thermometer, then yes, these artists have utterly failed.
Right. They are terrible thermometers.
But that is no longer the goal. The power of contemporary documentary doesn't come from dictating meaning efficiently. It comes entirely from its vulnerability and its demand for participation.
How does making it hard to see make it vulnerable?
By refusing to give you the easy answer, by refusing to be the voice of God, the photograph makes itself vulnerable to misinterpretation. It gives up its power. It provides visual clues, it provides context, but it forces you, the viewer, to construct the narrative. It forces you to engage your own critical faculties.
You have to do the work.
It transitions the photograph from a passive, consumable record of fact into an active, difficult tool for philosophical investigation.
It's the difference between being spoon-fed a moralistic story where you nod along and learn nothing versus being handed a complex mystery where you have to connect the dots yourself.
Precisely. If the artist gives you everything, the perfect lighting, the tragic subject, the obvious emotion, you consume the image, you feel a fleeting moment of pity, and you scroll to the next image. You are not changed. But if the artist holds something back, if the image is blindingly white or historically contradictory, you have to lean in. You have to work for it. You have to ask, why am I looking at this?
It stops you in your tracks.
And in a modern world that is completely overflowing with easy, instantly consumable, manipulative images, an image that makes you stop and struggle to understand it is arguably the most powerful document of all.
It respects the intelligence of the viewer enough to let them be confused. That is a brilliant defense.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring this massive journey full circle. We've covered an incredible amount of conceptual ground today, unpacking Susan Bright's text.
It's been a ride.
We have seen how art photography evolved, not by strictly following the rules of reality, but by breaking them over and over again to see what was underneath.
Indeed. We saw Cindy Sherman use the masquerade to prove that the true soul we desperately search for in a portrait is often just a highly constructed, culturally learned performance.
And we saw the new topographics movement strip away the romantic filters to reveal that the pristine landscape is largely a casualty of our own human consumption.
And finally, we saw the new documentary photographers demonstrate that objective truth is a myth and that meaning is highly subjective and utterly dependent on context and viewer participation.
Photography started out in 1839 as this humble servant to science, expected to just quietly record the facts. But it grew up. It realized its own power. It realized it could lie, it could stage, it could obscure, and it could question the very nature of existence.
It fully embraced its promiscuous nature.
It totally did. And that leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Susan Bright mentions the dawn of the digital revolution in her text, and how Photoshop started taking us further away from indexical reality into digital fantasy. But looking at where we are right now, we are living in a world where every single image we encounter can be instantly manipulated on a smartphone before we even see it.
Furthermore, we are living in the age of generative AI.
Oh, completely.
We have algorithms that can generate utterly photorealistic, hyper-detailed scenes from scratch based on a few typed words. The footprint in the mud can now be generated without the boot ever existing.
Exactly. The ambiguity, the staging, the manipulation, the questioning of truth that these avant-garde art photographers fought so hard to introduce over the last 50 years. That is no longer high art in a gallery.
No, it's everyday life.
That is our daily reality on social media, in political advertising, and on the internet. We all inherently know the image is a lie.
The masquerade is complete.
So the terrifying, fascinating question is, what happens next? Now that society expects every photo to be a lie, will the art photography of the future try to find its way back to some new radical form of objective truth?
It's a real possibility.
Or will it push us even further into the masquerade until we literally cannot tell the difference between the physical world and the constructed image at all?
That is the new frontier. And whatever it looks like, it proves definitively that the camera is far, far more than a simple thermometer.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the evolution of the lens. We hope it makes you look a little closer and think a little deeper about the images that shape your reality. Keep questioning the frame.